Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm excited to be here today with Craig Callé, who is a independent consultant running a firm, Source Callé, and he is an expert on third-party risk management and cybersecurity and privacy categories. Craig, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Craig, let's start with definitions. What is third-party risk management?
Third-party risk management is considered a subset of GRC, or governance, risk, and compliance. And so at the highest level, you think of GRC as a set of activities that helps an organization achieve its objectives, address uncertainties, and act with integrity. And frankly, we could have a long conversation just about that. But third-party risk management, or TPRM, is a very important subject all by itself, because for a lot of reasons, particularly because from a cybersecurity standpoint, more than half of all data breaches are through insecure third parties, and companies need to do a much better job, understanding just what kinds of relationships they have throughout their organization and monitor them much more carefully. And so that's not an area that you can solve with one technology tool. It frankly takes a village of tools as well as processes, and that's where we come in.
Okay. Within third-party risk management, I suppose a big element of that, but not the only one, is cybersecurity stuff, right? But there could be others. And before we delve into it like super deep, what would some of those other categories be? I imagine like one might be, reputation management or supply chain issues. Like you don't want to have your supplier offshore be using child labor or something like that. So, and because that would be reputational damage and maybe legal damage and so forth. And so beyond just cybersecurity, what's the list of other types of risk categories that we might be worried about?
Right. Well, you certainly gave some really good examples of other types of risks than just cybersecurity. I got involved in the third-party risk management business firsthand in maybe 20 years ago when I was at Gateway Computer, and we had one of our Asian suppliers go bankrupt, and that kept us from getting all the product we wanted out to retail channels at a very critical point in our turnaround. So I found myself the next day in a meeting with our CEO and our head of ops and supply chain, agreeing on a plan to make sure that sort of thing didn't happen, that we didn't get bitten by the risk of financial viability. And so cybersecurity has become really the gravitational pull because of the number of issues there. But privacy is an important risk. There are all kinds of regulations, be it GDPR in Europe or in California, CCPA, and there are many others across the US and around the world, to ensure that companies have a firm grip on the data of of consumers and how they're handling it. And so these regulations give authorities give consumers the rights to have their data deleted, right to be forgotten, and other rights like that. And you can't follow through or comply with privacy regulations unless you're able to follow that data to third parties. Another area of scrutiny involves ESG and sustainability. So lots of companies today have very elaborate programs that map out objectives at their own company level, but you just as well need to ensure that your third parties are aligned with those same goals and objectives. You touched on some things that typically fall in the sanctions category, and there are all kinds of laws relating to that around the world. And so reputation is one area that you mentioned is certainly important. Child labor, I think you mentioned as well. Anti-money laundering is an important objective of such regulation, and bribery. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act here in the U.S. So lots of different sanctions regimes all around the world that you have to be attentive to, not just for your own company, but as it relates to the third parties you work with.
How is third-party risk management different from enterprise third-party risk management? Is that just a fancier term to give someone a bigger title, Or is, I imagine that enterprise third party risk management logically would probably be a subset of third party risk management. So, what specifically does enterprise third party risk management mean when someone says that term?
I think you might be referring to ERM or enterprise risk management as opposed to third party risk management. These are all subcomponents of GRC. And so in
We had a client who was like the head of enterprise third party risk management. So maybe that's what they call it when you're doing it for the whole company, like a big
I
corporation.
suppose. Yeah, I mean, I think other you're talking about sort of titles and the like. Certainly group or global or enterprise all connote a sense of broader responsibility. But for the work I do, with the largest enterprises in the world, as well as smaller firms like private equity firms, when you think about this category, you tend to just refer to third party risk management. That's not to say that we can't have deeper conversations that already exist within companies, and I think your question about other types of risks are an important component of that. At the same time, I think just defining what we mean by a third party is an area for investigation. So typically, and maybe in a synonymous manner, people might refer to TPRM as vendor risk management or VRM. Those are somewhat synonymous. Third party is meant to be a broader description because it should include other parties like outsourced providers, software as a service or SaaS apps, and cloud hosts like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and the like. Contractors, ecosystem partners, be it a technology partner or a channel partner. In finance circles, you'd refer to counterparties, and there the risk is typically based on gaining an understanding of short-term liquidity. Is my counterparty going to be good for the swap at the end of to close out a swap at the end of the month, that sort of thing. But you also want to make sure that your counterparties are cyber secure and adhere to other forms of risk that we've already described. So it's like so many parts of technology, you can get lost in the alphabet soup, if you will. But I think those clients of yours that we're talking about, enterprise third-party risk management, are just looking to do this work, across the company as opposed to, say, a division or a business unit.
I think that must have been. I think each business unit had a third party risk management
Mm-hmm.
director, and then this was the person across all business units. So, could you talk just a minute before we dive further into third party risk management? You mentioned it's a category of GRC. If for the head of GRC, the person responsible for that, beyond third party risk management, what are the other units or things that make up GRC beyond third party risk management? Just so I have the broader view.
Sure. It would include, as I mentioned, enterprise risk management. And, along with that body of work, you would typically find a risk register, as it's called. And that's a compilation of all the things that can bite you, I suppose. One can be cynical and say that no risk register is ever complete. I mean, who had COVID on their risk register in 2019, I suppose. But you have to try, and you have to keep thinking through the issues in order to build a more predictable, measurable system to ensure that the company achieves its objectives at the lowest possible risk. So there are other aspects of ERM, but that's an important one. Business continuity or operational resilience, is typically a body of work you'll find under GRC, and that's a set of controls and risks that you have in place in order to both understand where you are in the journey, but also bounce back when bad things happen. And so that's becoming a very growing area of GRC, with certain cataclysmic events, perhaps attributable to global warming or climate change. So, significant weather disruptions and the like. And so that's an important area. I think a lot of GRC work inevitably revolves around picking a framework of some kind and building a program around it. So in cybersecurity circles, probably the most popular standards body would be NIST. There are other ones like COBIT and SANS and a couple others as well that have been well vetted and widely implemented. that give leaders a roadmap as to the sorts of controls that are appropriate to achieving, high standards of operation, and enable teams to call out areas of strength and weakness, usually expressed in, heat maps and traffic lights, red,
Yeah.
yellow,
So in
blue.
addition to enterprise risk management, third party risk management, business continuity, resilience, what would the other areas under GRC be? I mean, we didn't talk about compliance yet. So I imagine just like internal compliance, is that usually a category?
Yeah, it's the compliance aspect, inevitably create a methodology for ongoing monitoring of your operations, and ensuring that you're complying with, an ever growing list of rules and regulations around the world. So you can see it's a very far ranging set of activities.
What's the governance piece refer to? I mean, I think of governance, I think of boards of directors and so forth, but I mean, I suppose governance goes all the way down. But
Yeah.
in the context of GRC, in terms of systems and like, what would the director of governance be? If reporting to the head of GRC and there's like four or five directors or VPs, what's the head of governance mean?
Yeah, yeah. Well, first, I'm not sure if you're thinking that there's, within GRC, that you'll naturally find someone with a title, of governance separately, of risk separately, compliance separately. These are usually teams, within the general GRC umbrella. But when I think of the governance aspects, it ties back to those kinds of frameworks that I mentioned that set forth the controls within which you expecting your organization to operate, so that you can call out, the risks of falling outside of those controls, sort of, being in the red zone, if you will, and figuring out how do you get it to the green zone, and under what kind of time frame. And so it's really the governance aspects, is embodied in the roadmap that you set forth for yourself, inevitably guided by a framework. I've talked about IT, but there can be other areas as well.
Just talk to me a bit about organizations. So in a Fortune 500 company, let's say, what would the title of the person be who's responsible for GRC, and who do they report to? Do they report to the CFO or something? Like what would their title typically be?
Yeah, I mean, CFO is not is certainly a popular C-level executive for this to roll up into, but at a Fortune 500 company, GRC is important enough for it to report to a head of risk, a chief risk officer, a CRO. Uh,
Okay.
there may be a solid line to the CRO and a dotted line to the board audit and risk committee, for example. But there's, any Fortune 500 company, I don't have hard statistics, but you're likely to see somebody with a title director or VP GRC, and they would tree up usually into a CRO. Certainly could go to a CFO,
Okay.
particularly
So
those where maybe finance risk is a greater concern than some of the other risks like cyber, for example.
so we have a chief risk officer. Reporting to that person is, let's call it a vice president of GRC. And then reporting to the vice president of GRC, what's the title of the person who's responsible for third party risk management?
Well, increasingly you're finding someone with that title, say director of third party risk management. I think, maybe I'd highlight a deficiency that I see today that I'd like to help correct over time. But you find that when a company has set about establishing a third party risk management program, it's centered in cybersecurity. So a CISO would tip a chief information security officer would own that process. And a firm like mine can come along and point out some of these other risks that need to be monitored and managed. And frankly, I think there's a bit of siloing out there. It's not natural, for someone to sit down and put all these risks, under one umbrella. I think they should. There's certainly, good arguments for that that we've touched on here. But the gravitational pull is cybersecurity, and so the answer to your question would be, if there was a director, a reporter, or a heavy influencer to the process, it would be the chief information security officer and their team, who's tasked to look out for those third parties. And then the effort becomes one of, how many is the team able to assess, under what time frame, and so there's a natural tiering that goes on to focus on those more critical vendors or third parties in the community. But as I said before, when I first got into this business 20 years ago, by happenstance, frankly, it was with a financial risk. And so I happen to be corporate treasurer as well as CFO of two of the three divisions. It was sort of my second shift, starting at 7 p.m. with calls to Asia. Wasn't in the original job description, but I actually enjoyed it quite a
So
lot.
let's talk about what the director of third-party risk management actually does in terms of the types of processes that they would do. And I'm imagining it might be something like the following. I'm going to kind of take a guess, and I'd like you to correct me. Or I imagine that there's one piece of this is onboarding of new third parties, like a sort of a initial sort of have the person fill out some sign up form and review it. And maybe you give it more scrutiny if it's very sensitive or whatever, but there's be some onboarding process, number one. Number two, there's probably some sort of periodic audit that happens either randomly or scheduled. And then three, there might be in some categories of things like cybersecurity, some ongoing real-time monitoring, perhaps. And maybe there's also a reporting function, and maybe there's five is investigating and dealing with incidents and response. I don't know. So that's like my guess framework. But so, and that's kind of the nature of the answer I'm looking for. But correct that, update that, edit that to real life, not just my guess.
Well, I think that the answer is, it really depends on the organization, their level of maturity, and getting back to that sort of siloed notion that I raised previously. For example, you can have a procurement department taking on some of these roles. Certainly, onboarding is one of those. And as I point out to the people I work with, usually in the CISO's department, I ask them, how many vendors did you take on, but only get to address once they become suppliers? And the answer, sadly, is too many, especially given how third-party risk people can be perceived as blockers, taking too long to get through their assessments. And so should be focused on, how do I provide this service, to the ultimate relationship owner, in a fast yet thorough manner so that I have that ability to opine on the risks that we're taking on by bringing them in as a third party. So onboarding, frankly, is a bit of a touchy subject because TPRM professionals aren't always positioned to have that first look, and you'll never have, of course, you'll never have as much influence on a potential third party than you would before you've actually signed them up in a contract.
Yeah.
Your next chance is going to be, on contract renewal. That could be a year or more later. But certainly, once they're in the community through one means or another, then yeah, as you point out, there is an ongoing monitoring capability, ongoing monitoring requirement. But the first step usually involves some form of questionnaire. An organization called Shared Assessments tried to solve the problem of people coming up with individual assessments maybe 20 years ago when they first introduced their standardized assessment. And there are, of course, varying types of those today and varying lengths depending on how deep you need to get.
I've not seen the shared assessment, but I've filled out plenty of these onboarding forms. Some of them are much more annoying than others.
Well, yeah, and I would say some of them can be as long as 1,000 questions.
I have seen one of those. Well,
Yeah,
maybe not 1,000, but it was in the hundreds. It was in the
I
hundreds.
have to say we should spend some time in this conversation, talking about how things could get better. But there are times when I feel like the industry is more wrapped up with coming up with the perfect 999th question
Mm.
than to and perhaps losing the forest for the trees, if you will, than in achieving some of the other aspects that can make TPRM more effective and influential within an organization. So there's the questionnaire, and then maybe 2011 you saw the emergence of a category called cyber risk ratings. This was a category pioneered by BitSight. There are other names in the industry like Security Scorecard, Risk Recon, maybe two or three others. And what they do is monitor an organization and track all of the risk factors that are visible from the outside. So they're non-invasive, they're objective, and the goal is to try to quantify the vulnerability to a data breach based solely on what you can see from the outside. So it's certainly not a comprehensive assessment, never purported to be one, but it's certainly more than a smoke detector. But importantly, in a sea of third parties that a TPRM professional has to sort through, it's a way to triage the group and pay more attention, so you can pay more attention to your third parties that are in need of more attention. And some of these risk factors can include, their ability to patch software quickly, what we call patching cadence, determines whether the certificates, so-called SSL certificates, are valid, haven't expired, that is, and that they're configured correctly, and whether ports that should be closed or open. I mean, those are just three of maybe 24 different risk factors that a cyber risk ratings firm will continuously monitor. And that also gives the TPR professional an opportunity to compare the responses that they're getting on these lengthy questionnaires with the objective data that would map to the control elements in the questionnaire itself. Maybe more often than not, it's an incompatible response, is merely a result of oversight. Sometimes they could be intentionally misrepresented. And so it's a good chance to use ratings to cross-check these responses and have a deeper objective discussion with the respondent. So those are some of the elements. You mentioned reporting. Certainly, getting this communicated up to the relationship owner is all part of making this an ever more complete process. And certainly when there are noticeable deficiencies in the security posture or in the risk compliance, I don't want to harp just on cyber. You can call that out and take corrective action. So there's a lot of work involved, a lot of in-depth analysis. I forgot to point out with certain of your most critical third parties, you're going to maybe take even more invasive steps like a penetration test and that sort of thing, on-site inspection, good old shoe leather. And it's, as much as we try to automate a lot of this, and AI has become, not surprisingly, an ever more popular tactic to parse through voluminous data to call out the central facts. Having human involvement in the process has been, and I think always will be, an important element, despite opportunities to automate things through AI and other means.
You pay a lot of attention to the different types of software within the world of third-party risk management, and that one of the things you do is help clients, select the right software. Could you talk through the categories of software within the third-party risk management universe?
Yeah, sure. There are, as I said before, there's not one silver bullet, but rather, a collection of tools that one might use to get their arms around, the third-party risk management process. So it typically starts with a workflow automation platform. These platforms can come from names like Process Unity, Metric Stream, ServiceNow, LogicGate, Archer, Venminder, Diligent, Navex, OneTrust, BitSight. The list is long. Some are pure play TPRM platforms, and some treat TPRM as one of several modules, usually within a broader GRC or procurement suite. Those are the essential platforms that have facilitated the issuance of assessments and questionnaires and other assessments, and have workflows for review of those responses, routing to particular people or groups within an organization to clarify or seek other information, that sort of thing. And as I mentioned, maybe 10 plus years ago, you started to see the emergence of cyber risk ratings. And so I'd say I followed that category from literally concept to business to industry, where there are, two firms that represent over half the market share. And they're now a natural complement to those workflow platforms so that you can triage the community of third parties and then importantly, continuously monitor them with those tools. And with results that are easy to digest, don't require an IT certification to understand, something a board member could follow. It's not a doesn't have a cyber background, for example. 250 to 900 point scales are reminiscent of FICO scores and the like, or letter grades, like your report card would have had, A to F, that sort of thing.
I'd love to hear a little bit, Craig, about your practice. So tell us a little bit about your firm.
My firm is 8 years old at this point. It is focused around serving as a channel partner to about 20 best of breed technology vendor partners. We take pride in finding novel yet proven firms that aren't obvious to the rest of the world, and importantly, serve as evangelists for those that we think will go on to define a category. And when there's a Gartner Magic Quadrant or Forrester Wave or some other research report, they'll be in the upper right, maybe 2 or 3 years down the road. So we've had a pretty good track record of finding those emerging companies that come on to dominate a particular category. And so it's part reselling, part advisory. There we start, of course, trying to understand what customers' problems are and what are the best ways to sell them. Perhaps it's just a technology tool, but inevitably there's a process element to it as well that we can help people think through. Before starting my firm, I was at a firm called SHI. That's the second largest value-added reseller in North America and the largest reseller of Microsoft, among other things. Probably the biggest difference between what I was doing there as a chief strategy officer, among other responsibilities, is that we're going a mile deep in a relatively few number of vendors, whereas that big firm, which is, I think, probably over 12 billion in revenue now, sometimes called the largest IT services company that no one's ever heard of, frankly, but a great place. They tend to be more a mile wide and an inch deep, except in some of the large vendors like Microsoft, Cisco, Dell, Lenovo, that sort of thing. So that's the way we differentiate ourselves in a crowded market. Picking what I like to call the large, growing yet still remarkably underaddressed set of vulnerabilities out there. And I think third-party risk, for all that we've covered in the last 10 plus years as an industry, there's still much more to do, and that's what gets me up in the morning.
All right. You said earlier some thoughts you have about how third-party risk management can be improved. What are some of the common opportunities you see to improve that function?
Well, as they say, don't get me started, but say that
I just did.
yeah, I get one. Thank you. Happy to respond. I mean, because I find myself, as much as I've spent 8 years reselling tools of the trade, I'm just as likely to point out some of the shortcomings. So some of those issues might involve the fact that TPRM, I think, as a field, is become something of a cul-de-sac within GRC. I think it as a practice, it can tend to rest too low in the organization, and I think it suffers from the kind of senior level sponsorship that I think it deserves. I imagine the day when this body of work is not so much a part of GRC, but rather it's thought of as a separate body of work that might cause someone I'll call a chief third party officer, or CTPO, to orchestrate the activity across these different risk areas and throughout the full definition of third parties, and scrutinize those third parties just as intensively as a chief HR officer would scrutinize employees and job candidates. So we've gotten to that point now where, after, say, it's been 100 years since we celebrated the Ford Motor Company River Rouge complex, that almost completely vertically integrated organization, to, a world that has a decidedly horizontal bias. Think of Thomas Friedman in The World is Flat, and how we are so dependent upon third parties for so many of the things that we do today. Yet we're just scratching the surface when it comes to the risk aspects of those third parties. But just as important, we need to focus ever more so on the performance aspects. So that's why I see over the next 10 years, you're going to see this work evolve from a risk focus within GRC to its own elevated level, one of orchestration across CISOs, risk officers or GRC officers, procurement people, um, and take a more comprehensive view, looking not just at risk but also performance. So that's a fairly loaded partial answer to your question. I could tick off a couple other things if you like, but let me give you a chance to respond to that since it's a fairly loaded response, I think.
No, that's helpful. Maybe you could walk us through an example, a case study of how your firm has worked with clients to, select the right software for them. Feel free to sanitize it, of course. You don't need to name the client, but just kind of describe the general situation.
I think the response is really similar to a lot of situations where you're seeing an organization, even some large, seemingly sophisticated ones, still try to track all this work on spreadsheets. So whenever somebody tells me, for my different partners, who are their competitors, I always say Excel. Excel is a wonderful aspect of the Microsoft Office suite, of course. But when you consider how lengthy any assessment can be, how many you have to send, the need to respond to impartial or inaccurate responses, route internally, have an audit trail and all of that, you quickly start seeing the value of a platform. I think that there are certainly pros and cons of taking a best of breed approach versus a multi-module suite, or GRC oriented suite. I think there's certainly arguments for sharing data across modules. I think in practice there's some limitations to that, but I see it as just as much opportunity. So, for example, if someone has bought a module to focus on privacy, and then they want to then attack vendor risk, I think there's certainly a natural logic to connect your data map, a requirement of privacy, of complying with privacy regulations, to the third parties that might also hold data that you need to be aware of. But I think again, for most even large sophisticated companies, making those connections across, say, a group in privacy that might tree up to legal, with a third party program that is more likely than not to be handled by the chief information security officer. It can be a different silo, and you have to take extra effort to cross over and share information across platforms. But you walk into any company and then they inevitably have some solution. I mean, the notion of ripping and replacing is largely resisted, and so you sort of have to both understand the problem, but also the inherited solutions that are already there. And sometimes you're having to shoehorn in maybe a near fix, as opposed to my dream, of course, which would be to take a clean sheet approach to every client. That's unfortunately rarely the case. So the answer to your question again is it sort of really depends on where they are, what they want to accomplish, under what time frame and with what budget. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about those different elements as we try to create solutions.
Fantastic. Craig, where can listeners find you online if they want to follow up and get in touch and see more about your work?
Well, I have a website, www.sourcecallé.com. So that's SOURCECALLE.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn, so Craig Callé. And those are probably the two best ways to reach me.
Craig, this was a great intro. Thank you for being so patient with my very novice questions about the world of GRC. And thank you for joining today.
Well, there are no novice questions in this field, believe me. And I appreciate the interest, and thank you for making time for me.